Have you ever stopped to think that someone can write your fate and you don't even realize it? Before diving into this story, tell me, are you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, subscribe now, like and comment what you think. This will greatly help deliver this content to more people who, like you, love investigations full of twists and turns. Now let me tell you, in this case, the killer didn't just plan the crime, he wrote it before it happened. What's most intriguing is that this wasn't an ordinary threat, nor an anonymous note slipped under the door. It was a detailed, almost poetic letter that described every moment of a murder days before it happened. And when I say detailed, I mean it contained information no one could possibly know unless they were there or had seen it all in some other way. Throughout this investigation, we'll enter a labyrinth where psychology, fear, and even possible paranormal elements intertwine. I'll show you how a simple sheet of paper was able to manipulate minds, create suspects, destroy relationships, and leave an entire city on the brink of collapse. And what's more, how each clue seemed to lead me to a darker and more dangerous place. Brace yourself, because this isn't just a story about uncovering a culprit. It's about understanding the lengths someone will go to control the narrative of a crime, and how sometimes the truth can be even scarier than the lie itself. And in the end, perhaps you too will begin to look at any letter that comes your way with new eyes. I remember well the first time I heard about this story. It was a cold afternoon, and the wind blew through the cracks in my old office window, bringing that smell of rain that seems to portend something bad. A local journalist called me, his voice trembling, saying, "Katherine, you need to see this. It's not the kind of thing you ignore." That's how I learned about a mysterious letter circulating through a quiet little town, describing a murder before it even happened. And believe me, it wasn't just any murder. The city in question looked like something out of a postcard: narrow streets, flowers in the windows, and neighbors greeting each other by name. Nothing there matched crime, much less anything involving premonitions or anonymous messages. But this is the first lesson I learned in my career. Quiet places hold the darkest secrets. And when something like this reaches me, I know it's no coincidence, it's a calling. The curious thing is that, at the time, no one took the letter seriously. Some laughed, others thought it was a bad joke. But the description was so detailed that something inside me clicked like a light bulb on a blackout. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone predict a crime, but until then, every prediction I'd seen had a hint of charlatanism. Not this one. This one sounded like the voice of someone who knew exactly what was coming. And that's when I started to feel that chill down my spine that every seasoned investigator knows. Something told me this story wouldn't end well. More than that, it seemed like somehow I was already connected to it before I even arrived in the city. But what I didn't yet know was that this letter would be just the first piece of a much darker puzzle. I arrived in the city on a foggy morning, the kind where the fog engulfs everything and you can barely see 2 meters ahead. It seemed as if even the weather was trying to hide something. The murder had occurred just 3 days earlier, exactly on the date the letter predicted, not a day before, nor a day after, as if someone had followed a macabre script to the letter. That for me was enough to rule out the possibility of coincidence. The crime scene was in a more secluded part of town, near a forest that, according to residents, has always held dark stories. Children said they heard voices when they passed by at night. Adults swore they felt chills just getting close. And it was there, among ancient trees and a damp, leaf-covered ground, that the body was found. A scene that, strangely, matched every detail of what was written in the letter. The timing also caught my attention. The victim was killed shortly after 11 p.m., a time when the city was already asleep, and only the sound of crickets broke the silence. But there was something else. A resident claimed to have seen a figure standing near the scene hours before the crime, motionless, as if waiting for the exact moment to strike. No cameras, no clear witnesses, just a shadow in the memory of those who dared to look. As I walked through the scene, I felt the weight of the atmosphere around me. It was as if every tree was holding a secret, and at the same time, watching my steps. I knew that to understand what really happened that night, I would have to delve deeper, not only into the facts, but also into what people weren't saying. And it was in that moment that I realized the letter was just the beginning. The real mystery lay in the silence of those witnesses. The first time I held that letter in my hands, I felt a strange chill. It wasn't fear, it was more discomfort. The paper was yellowed, as if it had been stored for years, but the ink still looked fresh. And the words, the words weren't just a description. They were like a first-person narrative, almost intimate, describing every detail of the crime that hadn't even happened yet, from the position of the body to the smell of the air that night. It wasn't just what was written, but how it was written. The author used almost poetic language to speak of something brutal, as if he were describing a macabre work of art. The sentences carried a calculated weight, as if each comma had been placed to provoke a specific chill, and I know when a text is merely a threat. This one wasn't. This was an account of someone who had seen the scene before, in whatever form that was possible. The most disturbing thing was that the letter mentioned details that at the time no one could have guessed. Small but precise things, like the fact that the victim was wearing a specific ring on her finger, or the distant sound of a bell ringing at the time of the crime. It was impossible not to consider two hypotheses. Either the perpetrator was directly involved, or he had some kind of unusual access to information. And frankly, neither option was comforting. As I read and reread each line, I noticed something strange in the handwriting. Slight variations, as if the writing hand had hesitated at times. It was almost as if two personalities were fighting for the same pen. This, for me, opened a new door in the investigation. Because if true, what I had in my hands wasn't just a letter, but the clue to a possible psychological disorder or something even more disturbing. The letter didn't show up at the police station, nor did it initially reach me. It was delivered anonymously to the mailbox of an elderly resident, known around town for keeping more secrets than memories. His name was Mr. Ernesto, a former history teacher who lived alone in a wooden house on the side of the road. According to him, the letter arrived on a rainy morning, without an envelope, folded with almost ritualistic precision. To this day, he swears he saw no one approach his door that night. When Ernesto read the contents, his reaction was one of disbelief. To him, it was just the work of some bored prankster, and like any good curious person, he showed the letter to some neighbors that same day. The news spread quickly, but no one took it seriously, especially since the city had never witnessed such a brutal crime. Some even thought it was part of some mysterious campaign to promote a book or play. If only they had known what would come next. The most intriguing thing is that the letter disappeared for 2 days before reaching me. Ernesto claimed to have left it on the table, but when he went to show it to a friend, it was simply gone. 2 days later, it reappeared in the same place, without anyone having seen or heard any movement in the house. When he told me this, I realized that either someone was having fun confusing us, or we were dealing with something much more calculated. The reunion with the letter, however, brought with it a new detail, a stain of something that looked like blood, right in the bottom corner of the page. Forensics would later determine it was human blood, but the DNA didn't match any registered resident. This completely changed the course of the investigation, and set off a red flag in my head, because if someone was able to come and go unnoticed, taking and returning evidence, then we were dealing with someone who knew the game very well. The victim's name was Helena Duarte, 42, a woman who, at first glance, seemed to have her life perfectly organized. She owned a small antique shop in the city center and was known for her refined taste, always wearing elegant clothes and maintaining an air of mystery that made her even more fascinating to the locals. However, the more I investigated, the more I realized that Helena lived surrounded by untold stories and secrets she perhaps wanted to take to her grave. Helena wasn't just a businesswoman. In the 1990s, she was a renowned restorer in major cities, dealing with priceless historical pieces. But something happened, something that caused her to abruptly abandon her career and move to this small town. No official records explained the move, but former acquaintances hinted that she had been involved in a professional scandal that somehow never reached the press. This, to me, was reason enough to examine her past. Helena's social circle was restricted, almost hermetic. She kept in touch with few friends and didn't participate in community events, which fueled the curiosity of her neighbors. At the same time, she was highly respected by customers and suppliers who blindly trusted her judgment on rare pieces. It's curious how certain people can create an aura of respect and awe at the same time, and this duality always catches my attention, because it often hides something deeper. One detail that intrigued me from the start: Helena had an old safe in the store, but it wasn't used for money. According to a former employee, the safe held a collection of letters and documents that she wouldn't allow anyone to touch. Some people thought they were just family mementos. However, I had seen this kind of behavior before, and I knew that when someone protects something so zealously, it's because there's much more inside than just memories. In the early days of the investigation, the list of suspects seemed like a patchwork of familiar faces and untold stories. The first name that emerged was Marcos Duarte, Helena's younger brother. Although they maintained sporadic contact, confidential sources told me that the two had had a fierce argument months earlier over inheritance issues. Marcos swore he wanted nothing from his sister, but bank records told a very different story: debts, loans, and broken promises. Another name that quickly surfaced was Clara Mendez, a former employee of the antique shop. Clara had been fired under strange circumstances, accused of violating Helena's trust. Some said she had tried to sell a valuable piece without permission. Clara denied it, claiming Helena was paranoid and saw betrayal everywhere. But something in her expression when she spoke of her former boss told me there was enough resentment to fuel a crime. There was also the mysterious Mr. Oliveira, a collector who frequently visited the store and had a particular interest in items Helena wouldn't sell. He seemed to know more about her past than he should have, and according to some residents, the two had even argued loudly inside the store. The problem was that Oliveira was practically a ghost: no fixed address, no social media, no clear records, a real challenge for any investigator. And of course, there were the invisible suspects, those who don't appear in conversations, but leave subtle traces. People who knew where Helena lived, her schedule, her habits, the kind of people who prefer to operate in the shadows. In my work, I've learned that often, the culprit isn't the most obvious name on the list, but the one no one dares mention. And in this case, there was an uncomfortable silence when I asked about certain faces in the city. When the local police took over the case, I noticed that old pattern I'd seen so many times: a rush to present results and a fear of delving into the darker parts of the story. The chief of police, a burly man named Alan Carr, believed the letter was nothing more than a morbid coincidence. He wanted to focus only on tangible evidence: fingerprints, impressions, cameras, ignoring the fact that the letter had described the crime with surgical precision. I knew that if we went down that path, we'd end up missing something crucial. The first interrogations were quick, almost superficial. Key witnesses left the room without any essential questions being asked. Some, clearly nervous, were released without further ado. And the more I observed, the more I realized there was a general discomfort in discussing the subject of the letter. It was as if the document itself were taboo, something that bothered more than it helped. This omission, to me, was already a sign that there was much more at stake than met the eye. Meanwhile, I infiltrated the background, cross-referencing information the police hadn't even noticed. Dates, times, routes, behavior patterns, everything began to form an invisible map, connecting people and places in a strangely coherent way. But without the letter as its central piece, that puzzle was always missing a piece. And this left me feeling like I was one step behind someone who already knew all the answers. Even so, something told me the police wouldn't be the ones to solve this case. They were too stuck in conventional logic, in what they could see and touch. But I've learned over the years that some crimes can't be solved with forensic science alone. Some require other eyes. And it was at that moment that I decided to pursue my own line of investigation, parallel to the official one that would lead me down much less safe paths. I sent the letter to a handwriting expert I've worked with on other sensitive cases. His name is Cesar, a meticulous man who can find hidden truths in even the simplest strokes of a hand. When he received the document, he quickly called me. "Katherine, this isn't normal," he said, his voice thick with curiosity and unease. According to him, the writing displayed two distinct characteristics, as if it had been produced by more than one person or by a single, divided mind. Detailed examination revealed variations in pen pressure, letter slant, and even the way certain repeated words were written. In some passages, the text seemed to flow naturally, as if it were familiar to the author. In others, there was hesitation, as if the hand were trembling or the thought were interrupted. For Cesar, this could indicate a psychological disorder, a trance-like state, or even the interference of another person in the process. The strangest thing is that, despite the differences, the letter maintained an almost frightening coherence in its narrative tone. It was as if two voices spoke the same language, but each imprinted its own personality on the paper. And, when I compared this information with the crime scene, I realized that perhaps we were dealing with a perpetrator who not only planned the murder, but lived, mentally, every moment of it before it happened. When I showed this report to the police, their reaction was predictable: disbelief. They insisted on pursuing more objective avenues. But for me, this detail was pure gold, because if I could identify one of the voices in the letter, perhaps I would find the key to understanding who was behind it all. And that's precisely when the pieces began to fall into place in ways I hadn't imagined. Ever since the letter surfaced, I've realized it didn't just describe a crime, it shaped the minds of those around her. Helena, the victim, seemed to have changed her habits in the days leading up to the murder. She closed her store early, avoided long conversations, and according to a neighbor, even locked all the windows during the day. It was as if the simple act of reading those words had awakened a visceral fear in her, the kind that corrodes reason. The letter's impact on the community was also evident. People began to see danger around every corner, suspicious of every shadow. Small tensions between neighbors intensified, as if everyone was searching for an immediate culprit for the collective anxiety. It's curious how shared fear creates fertile ground for assumptions and hasty judgments. And this atmosphere in a way facilitated the work of the true author, whoever that might be. Psychologically, the letter acted as a trigger. It planted such vivid mental images that the victim and witnesses couldn't shake them. I've seen this before in other cases, where the mind begins to fill in the blanks with increasingly darker scenarios. It's as if the person becomes an accomplice to their own terror, helping to realize what they fear most. And this possibility made me wonder if the crime wasn't, in a sense, being co-written by the victim themselves. The most disturbing thing is that, while some isolated themselves, others seemed strangely stimulated by the letter. As if the text had awakened something dormant in certain minds: morbid curiosity, a desire for control, or even dangerous fantasies. And it was in this atmosphere of tension and distorted interpretations that I realized the investigation would not only be about finding a killer, but also about understanding how far a human mind can go when placed under extreme psychological pressure. In investigations like this, there always comes a point when the line between the possible and the impossible begins to blur. In the case of the letter, this happened when a local woman, known for her visions and premonitory dreams, contacted me. She swore she'd seen, in detail, the scene described in the paper, even before the document was delivered to Mr. Ernesto. It wasn't imagination, Katherine. It was like watching a movie I didn't want to see, she told me, her eyes welling up. Conversations with older residents revealed stories not recorded in official records. Some claimed that the part of the woods where the crime occurred was marked, a place where tragedies seemed to repeat themselves over the decades. There were reports of disappearances, unexplained deaths, and even similar letters appearing at different times. It was as if the town harbored a dark echo, always waiting to speak out. While my rational side always struggles with supernatural explanations, I can't deny that certain elements of this case didn't fit any conventional logic. How to explain the precision of the details before the crime, or the fact that the letter disappeared and reappeared without a trace? There are things science still can't explain, and perhaps never will. But experience has taught me not to dismiss anything out of hand, no matter how unlikely it may seem. As I explored this possibility, I noticed that some people seemed strangely comfortable with the idea that something on the other side was involved. For them, this hypothesis was more acceptable than imagining that a neighbor or relative could be capable of such an atrocity. And this preference for the inexplicable, curiously, ended up protecting the true culprit, whether human. While sifting through old files in the dusty basement of City Hall, I found something that made my heart race. Among documents from decades past were records of a crime that had occurred exactly 27 years ago, also in the same city. The victim, a young woman named Elisa Campos. Most disturbing, days before her death, someone left an anonymous letter describing the crime with eerie precision. It was as if I were reading an old version of Helena's letter. Comparing the two documents, I noticed striking similarities. The sentence structure, certain unusual expressions, and even the way the paper was folded were identical. However, most disturbing was discovering that the handwriting didn't match, which meant either the author was a master at disguising handwriting, or more than one person was involved in this macabre pattern. This repetition in modus operandi indicated something greater than a simple isolated act. It seemed like a ritual, a signature. As I interviewed the few survivors from that time, I noticed a pattern of silence. People looked away, changed the subject, or refused to comment. An elderly former neighbor of Elisa's told me quietly, "These things come back, Katherine. They always do." She wouldn't elaborate, but her expression said she knew far more than she cared to admit. This kind of resistance always indicates deep-seated fear, a fear that spans generations. With this new information, the case was no longer just about Helena. Now, I was faced with something that repeated itself like a dark cycle, possibly involving more victims who were never officially connected. It felt like I was pulling on a string, that with each new piece revealed that the ball of yarn was much larger and much more dangerous than I had imagined. On the fourth day of the investigation, something unexpected happened. The person who had originally received the letter, Mr. Ernesto, simply disappeared. No suitcase, no note, nothing to indicate prior planning. He was last seen walking toward the woods in the early evening, carrying a black umbrella, even though no rain was forecast. For a small town, a disappearance like that is like an earthquake. Everyone feels it, but no one knows where it came from. The police, predictably, began to hypothesize that Ernesto had fled out of fear or guilt, but I knew the man well enough to know he wouldn't abandon his home, his rare book collection, and especially his cat, whom he considered family. People like that don't disappear of their own volition. Something or someone made him disappear. And this, to me, wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. In the following days, rumors began to surface. Some said they saw a strange light in the woods on the night of the disappearance. Others claimed to have heard hurried footsteps on the road, but when they looked, no one was there. This type of rumor always appears in cases like this. And although many are the product of imagination, a few details caught my attention. Among them was the information that Ernesto had been seen talking to a hooded figure days earlier. This twist completely changed the dynamics of the investigation. Now I had not only a murder and a premonitory letter, but also a disappearance directly linked to the case. And the uneasy feeling that had been with me since the beginning only grew. It felt like my every move was being watched, and that I was the next piece someone wanted to remove from the board. Soon after Mr. Ernesto's disappearance, new letters began to appear in the city. At first glance, they appeared to be written by the same hand that had produced the original, but a closer look revealed something amiss. The sentences were less precise, almost caricatured, and the richness of detail had been replaced by generalizations. It was as if someone were trying to imitate the style to confuse the investigation, or worse, discredit the authenticity of the first letter. These new messages pointed to different suspects, each with a different culprit. One accused Marcos, the victim's brother; another, Clara, the former employee. They all followed the same pattern, dramatic language, but with glaring inconsistencies. For those who had never seen the original letter, it might have gone unnoticed. But I knew I was facing a dangerous game, where the killer could be hiding behind the deliberately created chaos. The most frustrating part was seeing how these false leads began to influence public opinion. Residents argued among themselves, old alliances and enmities were rekindled. The atmosphere of distrust intensified, exactly as someone very clever might have planned. In investigations, when everyone becomes a suspect, the real culprit gains time and freedom to act again. For me, these forged letters weren't just an attempt at distraction, they were a test. Someone wanted to measure how far I would go to differentiate the real from the fabricated. And deep down, I knew that following these clues could lead me into a carefully laid trap, or with luck, straight to the mastermind behind it all. Until that moment, I was accustomed to suspicious looks, whispers behind my back, and even a few doors slammed in my face. But one quiet night, while organizing my files, I found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with large, jumbled letters, "Stop now, Katherine, or you'll end up like her." There was no signature, no nopis clues, just the smell of smoke lingering in the paper, as if it had been partially burned before reaching my hands. The next day, I realized it wasn't an isolated warning. My inbox was full of strange emails, all sent from temporary addresses. Some were just vague phrases, others contained detailed descriptions of my routine, the time I left, the coffee I drank, even the color of the coat I wore the previous morning. It was as if someone was just a few steps away from me the whole time. This, I confess, made my stomach churn. It wasn't the first time I'd received threats during an investigation, but the accuracy of this information indicated that my observer wasn't just a curious person. He had the access, time, and courage to follow me unnoticed. This kind of proximity always sets off alarm bells in my mind. It's not just about solving the case, it's about surviving to tell the story. And yet, instead of backing down, I felt my focus sharpen, like a blade. I knew that if they were trying to intimidate me, it was because I was getting close to something important. Something that perhaps even the police themselves weren't ready to uncover. But as I've learned throughout my career, getting close to the truth is also getting dangerously close to the point of no return. It was during a rainy early morning, in the silence of my office, that the most disturbing piece of this puzzle emerged. I was re-examining the original letter when I noticed something that had previously escaped me: small, distinctive ink spots on the back, almost invisible to the naked eye. I decided to apply a developing technique I learned years ago, using ultraviolet light. And there, beneath that bluish glow, hidden words appeared, a short but devastating message. "I saw through your eyes." This sentence made me uneasy. The choice of words indicated intimacy, a direct connection with the victim or someone close to her. Cross-referencing this finding with the reports, I realized something even more sinister. Some of the information described in the letter could only have been known by those who were at the scene after the crime. This meant the author not only predicted the murder, he witnessed it and possibly participated in it. When I submitted this discovery to forensics, I discovered another alarming detail. The ink used to write the hidden message was different from the one used in the main text, indicating that the letter had been altered at different times. In other words, we weren't dealing with a single version of the letter, but rather a gradual construction, possibly to manipulate whoever received it and perhaps even me during the investigation. It was at that moment that I realized the letter wasn't just a warning or a threat. It was a living artifact, fueled by someone who wanted to control the narrative of the crime. And if this person was so comfortable playing with the truth like this, I knew the worst was yet to come. While sifting through Helena's old documents and private correspondence, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the entire case. Among receipts and personal letters, there was an exchange of messages between her and a man identified only as R. In these letters, Helena spoke of helping him financially during a difficult time, mentioning considerable sums that were never repaid. But the tone was curious. It began affectionately, almost maternally, and gradually transformed into sentences laden with resentment and disappointment. Upon further investigation, I discovered that R was Raphael, a childhood friend Helena hadn't seen in over 10 years, at least officially. Witnesses told me he'd been seen around town months before the crime, always avoiding large crowds. Their connection went far beyond money. Raphael had been one of the few people to know about a traumatic episode in Helena's life, something she'd never shared with anyone else. This intimacy to me was too dangerous to ignore. During interviews, I noticed that Raphael spoke of Helena with a mixture of admiration and resentment. He said she had changed and was no longer the same person she once was. When asked about the debt, he smiled, as if it were an irrelevant detail, but his gaze betrayed something else: hurt. It's incredible how, in so many cases I've investigated, the greatest tragedies arise not from pure hatred, but from distorted loves and broken expectations. This emotional connection opened a new possibility. What if the letter had been written not just to announce the crime, but as a form of intimate revenge, something to harm Helena's image and memory? This kind of motivation, veiled by layers of pain and pride, is often more dangerous than any desire for money or power, and in this case, it seemed to me that we were about to stumble upon a past no one wanted to revisit. Just when everything seemed to point to Raphael as the prime suspect, a new piece of evidence landed on the table and shattered my train of thought. A video, recorded by a security camera at a warehouse at the city's entrance, showed Raphael more than 50 kilometers away from the scene at the exact moment of the crime. The footage had the date, time, and even his face clearly captured. It was impossible to deny. Raphael couldn't have killed Helena. And this left me with a bittersweet feeling. The police's first reaction was to eliminate any connection between him and the murder. But for me, acquittal didn't mean total innocence. Raphael might not have been the perpetrator, but he could still have been involved in other ways. After all, the letter didn't necessarily have to have been written by the hand that took Helena's life. It was enough that it was created by someone with intimate knowledge of the facts and a burning desire to see them happen. The most disturbing thing was realizing that with Raphael ruled out as a direct suspect, we were practically back to square one. Every path I'd been following seemed to be falling apart, and the killer, or killers, kept one step ahead. It was as if every clue I encountered was deliberately placed there to lead me to a dead end. And frankly, this made me even more convinced that I wasn't dealing with a common criminal. This twist forced me to reevaluate the entire case from a new perspective. Now, it wasn't just about finding who killed Helena, but about understanding who had been manipulating the narrative all along, and more importantly, why. And deep down, I knew the answer might lead me to a place I wasn't prepared to face. The truth began to emerge almost silently, through details that, taken in isolation, seemed insignificant. It was during a visit to Helena's former home that I found the final key, a diary, hidden inside a wooden box in the store's safe. The pages were filled with fragmented notes, descriptions of disturbing dreams, and secret meetings with a person identified only as E. By cross-referencing these records with testimonies, I discovered that E was none other than Ernesto, the same man who received the original letter and subsequently disappeared. Their connection was long-standing. Ernesto and Helena had met at an antiques auction years ago and maintained a relationship that oscillated between friendship and a strange emotional dependence. The most striking thing, some diary entries suggested that Helena confided intimate details of her life to Ernesto, including fears and nightmares that she swore she felt were premonitions. It was from these conversations that I believe Ernesto constructed the letter, using her own fear as fuel. The investigation revealed that Ernesto had a history of psychological disorders and an almost artistic obsession with perfect crimes. He not only predicted, but also staged every step of the murder, choosing a perpetrator to carry out the act while he remained an observer and narrator of the tragedy. His signature was evident in every detail of the letter, but also in the gaps, the silences, and the manipulations that confused everyone. When they finally found Ernesto, he was in an abandoned cabin, surrounded by papers and objects related to the case. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "It's not about killing, it's about telling the right story." And in that moment, I understood that for him, more than Helena's death, what mattered was the narrative, and he had managed to write it exactly how he wanted. When the case came to light, and Ernesto was identified as the mastermind behind the crime, the city was never the same. That sense of security, which had once seemed unshakable, shattered like thin glass. Residents began locking their doors even during the day, and casual encounters in the square gave way to suspicious glances and whispered conversations. It was as if everyone had realized at once that the danger wasn't coming from outside, but could be sitting right next to them at the cafe table. The discussion split into two clear groups: those who believed Ernesto possessed some kind of paranormal gift, and those who saw it all as the result of psychological manipulation and criminal intelligence. This polarization created a climate almost of ideological warfare, where any mention of the subject sparked heated debates. Deep down, I realized that people were seeking answers that would alleviate their discomfort, and sometimes it was easier to believe in the inexplicable than to face human evil head-on. Businesses also felt the impact. Helena's shop was closed and transformed into a macabre pilgrimage site for curious onlookers and mystery seekers. Some took photos, others left flowers, as if the place had become a tragic landmark in the city's history. It was disturbing to see how a crime could transform a once ordinary space into a permanent symbol of fear and fascination. More than that, the case left invisible scars. Children who once played freely were now closely monitored. Neighbors who trusted each other began to avoid contact, and entire families moved away, never to return. What Ernesto did wasn't just taking a life, he broke the invisible web of trust that sustained that community. And this, in a way, was a crime that would linger for many years. After so many years investigating crimes, I've learned that the truth doesn't always bring relief. In Helena's case, uncovering every detail was like walking a maze, where at every turn, there were more shadows than answers. Ernesto showed me that. For some minds, crime isn't just an act, it's a narrative, a work they shape patiently and coldly, until each piece is exactly where they want it. And the most disturbing thing is that in this game, the killer doesn't always need to get their hands dirty. What struck me most was realizing how fear can be planted and cultivated until it blossoms into real action. The letter, the way it was circulated, the psychological manipulation, everything was designed to create an atmosphere in which the victim herself seemed to be walking toward the destiny written for her. This made me rethink how often, in life, we are not guided by stories others tell us, or that we ourselves believe without question. This case also reminded me that the line between the rational and the inexplicable is thinner than we like to admit. Even today, I can't explain some coincidences, nor can I completely rule out the possibility of something beyond the reach of logic. But as a researcher, I've learned to live with these gaps. Perhaps they're what keep the drive to keep searching alive, even when we already have an answer. As I left the city, I felt I carried with me not only the weight of this crime, but also a bitter lesson. Justice doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, it's simply the stark revelation that evil can be patient, intelligent, and above all, invisible, until the moment it decides to reveal itself. And deep down, something told me this wouldn't be the last time I'd see a letter like this. Now that you know every detail of this story, tell me, what's more dangerous, an armed killer or someone capable of manipulating minds to make a crime happen exactly as planned? The case of Helena and the premonitory letter taught me that. Often, true power lies in the stories we choose to believe. And deep down, we're all vulnerable to well-constructed narratives, whether in our personal lives, at work, or even on social media. And if you think about it, perhaps there are letters in your life right now, not on paper, but in words, advice, or information someone is putting in your mind, shaping your decisions. Have you stopped to identify what they are? And most importantly, who wrote them? This reflection can completely change the course of many things. I want to know, do you believe this letter was the result of pure human manipulation, or is there something unexplainable that science hasn't yet grasped? Tell me in the comments, because every opinion helps build new perspectives. And of course, your participation is essential to keep stories like this told here. So, if this case has you hooked so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. After all, you never know when the next letter will appear, and you might want to be prepared when it arrives.